I'm just going to try and set the scene by raising a few issues, if you like. And the first one I was going to talk about, we're all aware that root systems in a natural environment are quite different from those that are typical of urban vegetation. And I thought I would just begin by reminding us of a few of the key features of tree root systems and how they're modified and what we've learned, or I was thinking over the weekend what we haven't learned, because I had a terrible sense of deja vu on some of this. Some of these topics we've been talking about for an awfully long time, and there's been relatively little progress. So we all know about roots, we know about their anatomy, we know that they exploit the volume of soil, that they pursue the lines of least resistance, that they move down concentration gradients, that root hairs and mycorrhizal fungi are all really important for the sort of functions that the tree undertakes. What we perhaps have forgotten is that we've learned a great deal about tree root systems in the last 20 years. And when I say we, I'd like to think I mean most of the people in the room. It's amazing how little of that information we've successfully communicated to other professions, so that when you talk to accountants, lawyers, engineers, even landscape architects, when you look at the sorts of structures they're creating, the sort of interactions they're anticipating, and even the drawings that they do, they don't reflect any of those changes. They don't reflect any of the new information of the last 20 years, which I think is really quite sort of staggering. We've known a lot about the soil microflora and fauna. There's a lot more to know, don't pretend otherwise. But we do know a lot about the mycorrhizal fungi. We know about the suites of fungi that sort of grow with and around and in root systems. But very often we don't take any note of them. And I'm fascinated, for example, that in the algorithms that we use for calculating the amount of carbon that's fixed in woody vegetation, in other words, how much carbon is fixed in trees, there's almost no information on how much carbon is tied up in the mycorrhizal associations, which could easily double the carbon that's sequestered, the calculation of carbon that's sequestered below ground. We also know that very often there are different mycorrhizal associations that can occur with particular species of tree. We don't really know which associations are the active ones for any particular specimen, but we do know that the mycorrhizal fungi are a lot more active in terms of the soil microflora and fauna and the biology of the tree than just simply taking up nutrients and water. They are a part of the tree's defence system, and which suite of mycorrhizal fungi you have can have a big impact on the capacity of a tree to withstand various pathogenic attacks. We know that root systems can be trained and manipulated. For the most part, we don't do it. And again, I'd ask, why not? We know that if you use certain compaction, nutrient, irrigation and oxygenation regimes, you can either discourage roots or encourage roots where you want them. There's almost none of that done, except in very intense certain inner city plantings. One of the things I noticed this afternoon is that we're going to be talking about the way from the sort of geo and construction side, we're going to be talking about roots and the interaction with hard landscape structures. And as many of you will know, I'm highly critical of other professions that don't take into account the fact that tree roots are going to be in the vicinity of their structures, and so as a consequence don't manage the environment appropriately. They don't compact, they don't restore soil bulk density, they don't make sure that where they don't want roots, they undertake certain management practices, and where they do want roots, they undertake other management practices. More on that perhaps a bit later. And then of course we know that for the most part, root systems are relatively shallow and spreading. How spreading? How far do they spread? The best that I know of in Melbourne from my own personal experience is roots from a particular elm about 100 metres from the tree, about 100 metres. A disturbed site, lots of paving, lots of alterations. It's hard to believe that roots can travel that far. So we know that they're shallow and spreading, but again, do other professions know that? For example, just in the last couple of weeks, I've had a situation where a developer is arguing with one of the utility companies about their trees in nature strips. No trees in the nature strips because you could interfere with our services underground. They're 750 millimetres, those services below the ground. They're not going to interfere with any properly managed, the trees are not going to interfere with any properly managed site. And again, it's this risk aversion and a failure to understand that the world has changed. I'm going to come back to this point a few times. We also know that descending roots do occur, lots of them. But we also, for the most part, know the pattern of those descending roots. Tend to be more of them, they tend to be deeper, and they tend to be larger immediately above below the trunk of the tree. And as you move out, they tend to be fewer, they don't go quite as deep, and they tend to be at a greater angle. There's a lot of information on this sort of root architecture. And then let's have a look at whether the actuality, what you see in the field, actually reflects the theory. And what happens if it doesn't? So for example, here we've got a typical mountain ash growing in Talangi with a typical root system, as you can see. Quite shallow, within about 100 millimetres of the soil surface. This root is coming out from the trunk. It's already 10 times the radius of the canopy, already moved way out on this one side alone. And you can see how close it is. And of course, I'm just reminding many of you in this room, probably the most frequently asked question that I get when I talk to home gardeners, and I talk to a few thousand of them each year, remember, is what can I do about tree roots that are coming to the surface? And my answer, as you always know, is enjoy them, because that's what they do. Don't do anything else. It's again, isn't it a lack of understanding about the biology? And for those of you that like the physics of this sort of thing, just think about it. Let's imagine we've got a 100-tonne tree, something like a mature elm or an oak or a eucalypt. How much soil is displaced below the ground? Well, there's about 100 tonnes, 100 cubic metres of displacement. It has to go somewhere. And the most obvious place is it goes up. It can't go down and it can't be pushed sideways. It compresses a bit, but most of it comes up. So that's logical. Again, why aren't we managing it? Why aren't landscape architects taking these sorts of things into account? Why aren't developers aware of these sorts of issues when they're putting in new housing estates? I don't think ignorance, and I don't mean ignorance in the terms of not knowing, I mean ignorance in terms of we'll just ignore it, we'll pretend it doesn't happen and it might go away. The other thing I wanted to remind you, and particularly this group, and particularly today when you look at what happens after lunch, not all root systems are the same. This is the exposure, and it's not the best slide I've got, I must admit, but this is the air knife exposed root system at the weight on one of the Eucalyptus maculata. And what you're basically seeing is structural roots. You look for absorbing roots in the vicinity of the trunk and there aren't any. You can look all you like. You can go out on this particular specimen as we did, about 10 or 12 metres, didn't see an absorbing root at all. Why would it? The absorbing roots are way down somewhere in a drain that's running through the arboretum, tapping into water, and they've proliferated there. And then compare this with the elm. And the elm is the typical shallow, fibrous, not many large roots that we sort of have in all of our models. Now this is just to remind you, for example, that when you apply the Australian standard on the protection of trees on development sites, The formula is based on this ladder model, isn't it? Not on the former. But I'm sure you all have used that standard. I'm sure you're all familiar with that standard. And one of the things that it says is a competent, qualified arborist is supposed to have a look at these situations if there's variation. And then what are you supposed to do? Well, bugger me, you're supposed to get some data. You're supposed to get some information. It actually says that in the standard. How do I know that? Because the standard says if you're the arborist and doing the inspection, you have to be able to demonstrate. You have to be able to demonstrate, and there's only one way of demonstrating that you know where the roots are and the type of root system that you're dealing with is by collecting some data. How you collect the data is open to you. You can use ground penetrating radar if you like. You can use an auger. You can use a long screwdriver that sticks into the ground and try and find the large roots. But what you can't do is go to a site, stand with your hands in your pocket, do this, which connotes great wisdom, and say, I reckon this is where the roots are. Because if something goes wrong, someone in court simply says, can you show us how you demonstrated where the roots were? And if you can't do it, you haven't got the data, you're in strife. So what I wanted to say in this first part of setting the scene is we've got some lessons to be learned here. Urban trees are shallow and spreading. They grow down paths of least resistance. They grow along air, water and nutrient gradients. So install the services properly. Engineer foundations and footings for the presence of trees. Backfill around footings, slabs and trenches to re-establish the proper soil bulk density. Really simple lessons. Now, just as a matter of interest, in my own experience, have I seen trees disrupt footpaths? You betcha. Directly and indirectly. Have I seen them knock down fences? Yeah, I have. Have I seen them break a pipe? Yes, I have. But for the most part, these represent the vast minority of the problems that I've seen firsthand. They're the 1 in 100 or 1 in 10 situations. All the others are where you're looking at shoddy, incompetent practices, usually by other professions. And to give you an example, I have never seen a root system cause damage to a properly constructed footing or slab that has been appropriately engineered. Not once. Not once. Now, I've been before engineers before. They don't like you saying this. I've seen slabs that have cracked all the way through. I've seen footings that have cracked, and I've seen roots do great damage. The truth of the matter is, the growing tip of a root can only exercise so much force per square centimetre. And if the footing and the foundation are properly constructed, they cannot be damaged. When I built my home, the requirement was that my footings would be 90 centimetres deep and 30 centimetres wide, and I would use a certain gauge of reinforcing mesh. I priced the difference between going to 40 centimetres wide and using 2 higher grades. So not the one grade, the thicker steel, but one above that. It cost me an extra $350. It was so incidental to the cost that I was facing. Why wouldn't you? Just for the bit of peace of mind. Now, I'm not saying that soils don't shrink, and I'm not saying that trees don't contribute to shrinkage and heave, but I am saying that any engineer in this room that tells us that they cannot engineer footings and slabs to withstand those forces really tests my credibility. And bearing in mind that my staff at Burnley, I had 4 engineers and we looked at this pretty hard. And the other thing I wanted to remind you is the root systems are really important for a whole range of environmental and ecological services. So they are the take-home messages. And we've known and applied some of these take-home messages forever. For example, thankfully these days, boring equipment that goes under a tree is so good that you don't have to trench. This is a trenching diagram from the 1960s that says if you've got to have an open trench, don't cut near the trunk, go straight under it. How many of you have actually ever seen any one of the utility companies actually do that? Can you put up your hands? Thank you. There's 4 of you in this room. 4 of you have put up your hands out of how many? Roughly 120? 4 out of 120. I hope you've got slides, by the way. I found that the last time when people put up their hands to that question and I asked them to tell me where, no one told me. Not that I'm sceptical. The other thing I wanted to point out is that other places do well with their trees. Do you all recognise this? The world's biggest pot plant? This is the tree that was left in location in Hong Kong as they built the railway under it and around it. Why? Because they gave the tree priority after a public campaign. This is the same building site, shot from the same slide. So on one hand, you've got this intense sort of development by engineers, and on the other, this is what they did. It cost a truckload, an absolute truckload. But a point was made, and a point was made so that in future, when these sorts of developments take place, the right thing was going to be done by the vegetation. Now, having talked about those sorts of issues, I also wanted to talk about the consequences of not doing it right. I wanted to talk about what happens if we do get the soils and root interaction wrong, and we get, for example, Windthrow. And I don't want to go into this in great detail because I've spoken to some of you recently at the ARB conference about it. But one of the things I wanted to point out is that tree stability and tree safety, hazard and risk, is not just about looking at the canopy. It's about understanding what might take place. And one of the sort of points I'm making is that in relation to Windthrow, it's not always the strength of the storm and the amount of rainfall that we get that contributes to Windthrow. There can be many factors, and some of those factors are ones over which we have control. And we should be making sure that we exercise our professional responsibilities here. So the point I'm putting up is trees do get wind-thrown. Branches do fall. And you have to ask yourself, why? Why do they fall? And one of the theses that I'm going to be putting up to you is that it's very often because once we've put a tree in the ground, we walk away and then everyone else comes in and all sorts of things happen. Fill is put around, drainage lines are altered, people put trenches through root systems and then cover it up. Mulch is one of the great coverers up of past crimes. When you go to inspect a tree that's in a bed of mulch, you think, I wonder what's going on here. You scrape it away and have a look. It's amazing what you find. So as you probably know, we looked at about 80, and in fact it's over 100 now, but we actually looked at 80 trees that were wind-thrown in Melbourne. None of them had been sort of said to be senescent or in danger of falling. And we looked for correlations. And as you can see on this list, we talk about trenching within 4 metres of the trunk, significant damage to the lateral roots, usually by mowing or compaction, evidence of a loss of descending roots, evidence of soil compaction, the presence of fill around the base of trees, waterlogging, and the last one and the least sort of consistent symptom or correlation was canopy dieback and deadwood. Now, all this is saying to you ultimately is when you have an event like we had in 2005, where several thousand trees came down on the one night, you'll all remember this, February 2005, the storm, some of you would have been out there managing it. When we did a bit of a survey on this and we asked the City of Melbourne and we had contacts at the City of Hobsons Bay, where did the trees fall? And they all fell along pathways and roadways. Not some of them, all of them. They all fell along pathways and roadways. And so we went and had a fairly detailed look at this, and we've got some data that I've published already, and you can have this whenever you want it. So what did we find here? Very often, the storm is the trigger of the failure, but management has contributed over a long period of time. Now, I'm also saying to you that you can use these sorts of criteria to inform your assessments and to shape your management. I remind you, this is not a cause and effect study. We're not saying that if you cut through the roots, the tree will fall over. It's purely correlative. It's a purely correlative study. But what the correlations do, if you've got enough of them, you can go out and you can say, right, yes, we've dug through its root systems 5 years ago, cut them all off. Yes, we've put 30 to 50 centimetre fill around the base. When we tested, the soil was anoxic, okay, so we've really mucked up the sort of the waterlogging situation. And the more boxes you tick, what does that do? It puts you on alert. That's all it does. It doesn't mean the tree is going to fall. It means that you have a higher management responsibility and you need to keep your wits about you. So what we're trying to do here is to say to you, look, these are the things that you should be looking for in your evaluations. Someone says to you, we want you to go out and do a risk and hazard assessment. Here are 7 things associated with the root system that might be of assistance. Now, they're not going to tell you everything. And if you tick all the boxes and the tree's still stable in the ground, hallelujah. Aren't trees wonderfully resilient things? And sometimes that's going to happen. Now, another point I wanted to make is there is a massive body of literature out there on Windthrow. And I'm not just talking about a few papers, I'm talking about hundreds, thousands of them. Many of them relate to forest trees because Windthrow in forestry reduces the timber yields. It's big business and big money. But there's a fair bit of stuff on urban vegetation too. And so, for example, we know that Windthrow tends to occur in 3 basic failure patterns. A straight tapered root simply pulled out of the soil when the frictional forces between it and the soil fail. A second one is that many small lateral roots can be pulled gradually from the soil. And in the right conditions, you get a progressive breaking of the roots and over she goes. And the third one is where you sort of get a break, a break, a break, a break, and then eventually she gives. Now, this is, well enough and known that in the United States, they use a typology that says we've got a pattern 1, pattern 2, pattern 3 failure. We haven't done that here in Australia to the best of my knowledge, or if we have, no one's published the data. It would be worth looking at what sorts of failures we have, and some of you are in a good position to do this. Now, the other thing I wanted to point out to you is that in relation to Windthrow, the descending roots are really important. We all know how important the root plate system is for absorption of water and nutrients, but don't forget the descending roots are really important in terms of stability. And very often what happens is we are conscious of what's happening with the root plate, but we may not be sort of thinking about what goes on underground. And so, again, you come back to how does the model work? Where are the roots? Where are the descending roots? And descending roots are very hard to sort of pick up with the scanning and other testing devices. You're pretty good at picking up the root plate. Very difficult to know where the descending roots are. So one of the things I was going to point out to you is that structural roots are really important for root stability. They're supposed to be protected under many of the standards, such as the Australian Standard for the Protection of Trees on Development Sites. And that standard gives you a reasonable set of guidelines which, if you turn them on their head, act as a sort of a guide to what you're looking for in your inspections. So the standard says, here's the structural root zone, this is how big it should be. You can go out and find out. Yes, the roots are there, you can locate them. So you can use the components of the root system, of the standard, to inform a diagnostic analysis that allows you to measure things. So it's not just about protecting the trees. And if someone says, why did you do that? Why did you look there? You can say, well, I used the Australian standard as a guide to inform my diagnostic process. And an Australian standard is a pretty good thing to use. Now, one of the things that I did want to mention today is that root systems are not necessarily symmetrical. And this is something that you all know and that I've referred to already a couple of times. But it's really important if there is a windward side to a tree to be aware of this. So this is a little diagram that I've done of a tree root system, and you can see that about 60% of the roots are on the windward side. Now, all I'm saying to you is if those roots are on the windward side and they're really important for stability, then use that. Use that in your management. Use that in your design. You may not be in a place where there's any wind at all. Fantastic, don't have to worry about it. Okay? But most of our cities in Australia are on the coast. Most of them have a prevailing wind direction, or they might have two prevailing wind directions. So you could easily see if in Melbourne you're getting north and westerly winds, that particular ellipse is going to be sort of skewed and fanned out a bit. It's not going to be quite as simple as the one I have here. 60%. Now, once you map that out, all you've then got to say is, I don't really want to be buggerising around with that side of the tree. If I cut something there, if I cut a major root on that side, I could be causing significant trouble. You get out the other side, you might only get to the drip line, and you've got no roots at all. No roots at all. But on the other side, the roots on the windward side, the roots could be this big and still heading out from the drip line. So the architecture of the root system, how it interacts with the soil and the type of soil, really important here. And once again, we have some information that can inform your management practices. Just a couple of points to note, and I will make sure that Shane has the PowerPoint. I think he puts it up on your website afterwards. You'll notice here, usually what happens in a windthrow event, the leeward lateral roots bend and eventually break. The windward lateral roots are pulled from the soil, often with their descending roots, if present, intact, but very often there's no descending roots, as I've said. The taproot, if it has one, highly unlikely, but it probably has one or two of the larger descending roots. Then the tree actually rotates on that root, okay? And believe it or not, the pattern of windthrow is essentially the same whether you're dealing with dry soils or wet soils. Essentially, it's just where the breakage occurs might be further out or closer in, depending on whether the soil is wet or dry. So, the implications from this, give trees adequate root space. Don't put fill around the trunks of the trees. Try not to interfere with, cut, otherwise cause damage to the lateral roots in particular. Try and avoid soil compaction and check your drainage from time to time. And don't pave over existing root systems, even if it is a favourite thing of landscape architects. So try to avoid those sorts of things, some simple rules. Now, I don't know how I'm going for time. I think it's just after 9, is that correct? Can someone just keep an eye? Good. There's no clock in here and I'm using my phone. So I've got about 5 or 10 minutes to go because Shane has basically said that there's a trapdoor here somewhere that if I go over I fall through. So just briefly talk about the Australian standard. And again, setting the scene. Standard on development sites. Not perfect. Some of you are going, bloody well, sure about that. Very much not perfect. People in New South Wales would say, don't like it at all. But I do think it has some merit. And one of the things that I like about it is there is a role for a trained and qualified arborist, okay? Trained and qualified arborist. And you're asked to do things, and some of them are listed here. And then you're asked to give a much more detailed analysis. Now, within the standard, it's very flexible what development means. Don't you love the fact that the standard covers festivals, use of parks, other events that require approvals? Now, what I like about this, with my National Trust Register of Significant Trees hat on, I have to deal with the Melbourne International Flower and Garden Show up in the exhibition building gardens. Here it is. You use that standard. You say to the developers, you compact the soil, you're in big trouble. How do we do this? We actually measure the bulk density before and after the show. Now, some of the locals don't like it because they say, we don't want this, it compacts the soil. Answer, we measure it. We're not acting on hearsay, we actually have some data. Shock and horror. Data, information. So, do you see how flexible this is? How flexible this is. And it means you can use it in a whole range of circumstances. And I would argue that if any of these circumstances apply to you and you're not using it, or your organisation is not using it, you leave yourself legally exposed. Because if you got up in court if something goes wrong and said, but we use the Australian standard, it's the same with pruning, we use that, and if you've used it competently and properly, then you're going to be protected. It might mean the standard has to change, but the legal system will say you did the professional thing, and that's what's required. Now, a couple of things. We talk about the Crown Protection Zone. Today, not interested, right? Important, we all know that, but today, that's not the thing. The Root Protection Zone is where you go. And it talks a whole range of things, and measurements and guidance. Now, you know, the standard says, we know that this does not apply to every single specimen. It applies to things like the elm I showed you earlier. It did not apply to the maculata. So what does the standard say? The standard says if you don't know where roots are, if there's going to be encroachment, you have to measure. That's what it says. And the formulae, the diagrams are all, I think, clear and self-explanatory. So I'd like to think that people will be thinking about this afternoon as the geoengineers, the soil engineers and the soil scientists talk to you about soils and the way the root systems interact. You're thinking to yourselves, I know how the root system works, we've got an idea about the consequence of mucking it up through Windthrow, and we've got the Australian standard, which is a formulaic approach. We know that it oversimplifies root system structure. It's the best we've got. We're likely to have it for at least 5 years. It'll probably be renewed for a further 5 years before there's a major review in a decade's time. So we've still got about 6 years to go with a bit of luck, even if you don't like it. It talks about the structural root zone and it defines how you measure it. And then it talks about the tree protection zone. Now, I don't want to go into all of the standard because that's not the purpose of today, but I do want to remind you that it's there. Many of you are working in organisations that will have a copy of that standard available to you, and there are so many pirate copies of it online that there's no excuse for people not having access to it without paying a fortune to Standards Australia. But don't tell them I said that. And of course, various formula. Now, a couple of other things I wanted to point out. These are the restricted activities in the tree protection zone. Storage of materials. What does that mean? Well, everybody knows that on a domestic site, the logical place to put everything is under the trunk and canopy of the tree. And the explanation is it's only temporary. It's only temporary. What does temporary actually mean? Well, temporary might mean 18 months. Okay? And by the time the 18 months is gone, the tree is often completely ring-barked, dead as a dodo, or the soil that they've dumped around it is completely colonised by the tree's root system. And when you remove it, you've got really big problems with that specimen. Parking of vehicles and plants. Well, of course that's where you park them because you want them in the shade. Refuelling. Isn't it amazing how often a developer doesn't want a tree and then there's an accidental fuel spill? And where does the accidental fuel spill, usually of dieseline, always happen? Right under the tree. And the tree dies. What a shame. Okay, all by accident, of course. So you've got a whole range of prescriptions here. I can take you to almost any development site and show you, if not 1, 3, 4, 5 breaches of that list, which says you don't do it. Now, it's an Australian standard. How are people getting away with this? Is it because you're not using the standard? Is it because when you do try and have the standard used, others say, we're not going to use it? And all I can say to you is, if you don't use it and something goes wrong, the people who haven't used it are in serious trouble. I recommend it not because it's a great standard. Not even I think it's a great standard. But I think it's a tool to be used. And I love the clauses here where it said, when encroachment into the root protection zone would affect more than 10% of the RPZ area, okay, the project arborist must demonstrate that the trees would tolerate any resulting insects. Do you understand what that means? You must be able to demonstrate. If you can't demonstrate, then you can't allow encroachment. That's the implication. Now, I think this is a remarkably generous sort of term in the standard. It says, look, we're not going to be precious about our tree. We know that they're resilient. If it's a really healthy, vigorous tree and you need to encroach a little bit here, well, we'll make an allowance for it. Okay? The engineers don't do that. The accountant, my accountant has never come in when I've gone to them and said, oh, look, you haven't got the money to pay my bill? That's all right. We'll give you 10% sort of leeway this time. You can make it up next year. Never happens. But we, the arborists, have gone in and said, yeah, we'll be flexible. What more do they want of us? And even with a major encroachment, the same sort of condition applies. You can be flexible, you can use it to your advantage, you can use it to the developer's advantage if you've got the data, if you're prepared to demonstrate. Now, my last little message for the day. Root barriers. I know they're going to come up. And why are they on my mind? Someone rang me on Friday. My phone number, my mobile phone number, is very widely available apparently. And this person wanted to know whether they should put in a root barrier near their swimming pool because they wanted a screen. We resolved it, no root barrier. The camellias that have been there, and she's been chopping the tops off them, the sasanquas. I said to her, why don't you stop chopping the top off the sasanquas and they'll get up to 3 metres. She goes, oh, didn't think of that. Hung up. Didn't need any tree selection. You know, I am now Solomon the wise. Now, a couple of things. Just about root barriers. Do I like root barriers? Of course I do. I like the idea of them. They're logical. And I believe they can be properly engineered and constructed. I really believe that. However, most of the time that doesn't happen. Most of the time they're not installed properly. They're not installed with attention to depth. Roots can grow over the top and under barriers, and the material from which they're made has a really significant impact on their efficacy. So, what do I think of root barriers? If you're going to use one, for God's sake, do it properly. You know that when you cut roots, and you can't get this across to the general public because I've been trying for 35 years. You cut roots, what's going to happen? Proliferation. Particularly if you've cut them, mucked up the soil profile, aerated it, okay, the roots are just going to go boom, exactly where you don't want them. So if you put a barrier and you've cut a whole lot of roots and you don't backfill properly, the roots are going to go down, follow the barrier down, they're going to go under the barrier and they're going to come up because you've provided ideal growing conditions. The tree doesn't see it as a barrier, they see it as a root facilitation project. okay, to improve their chances of absorbing things. So if you're going to do it, please do it properly. That's all I'm asking. I'm not saying they don't work, because they can. Now, some of you are going to ask about horticultural chemicals and root barriers. Do they work? Yes, they do. The science is really good. Some of the anti-gibberellins, the copper-based materials work very, very effectively. The problem is you've really got to know what you're doing. The concentrations are absolutely crucial. And for many of us, we don't have the training, we don't have the staff with the required skills to work at that level with those chemicals. It's simple as that. But they can work. The copper-based root inhibitors are probably the simplest and the best, okay? But don't forget, it's a heavy metal. Don't forget, it's not just affecting the tree roots. No? We mentioned mycorrhizal fungi. We've mentioned the soil microflora and fauna. Okay? You whack a whole dose of heavy metal down there, you're going to get a consequence. So copper, because copper is used in Bordeaux mixture, we're inclined to think that it's okay and that it's safe. Familiarity breeds contempt. And finally, and this is my last slide, Shane, I am on time, common sense. Here's a summary of the things that you can do and that I see sort of the opposite done. I was at an industrial building a week ago. All the irrigation went from the footpath, hit the building, ran down the wall. Row of trees. Okay, I know where the roots are. I know where the roots are. So just think it through. The biology and the interaction with soils and roots are often the key to success. We're not working in an information vacuum. We have a great deal of knowledge which we can apply to these circumstances, and I am delighted to see the calibre of the speakers and the variety of the speakers that we have here today, because some of them are going to strongly disagree with some of the things that I've said, and I'm going to strongly disagree with some of the things that they said, but I am getting older and I am mellowing. Thank you.